So a while back we did a video on 3 shoulder impingements, 3 strategies, 3 solutions. Wouldn't it be cool if the hip was the same? It is. Good morning. Happy Tuesday. I have Neuro Coffee in hand and it is perfect. That's really good. Just got off a mentorship call. So I'm a little fired up. It was a really, really good one. It was very, very much fun. So let's go ahead and dig into Tuesday's Q&A. And this comes from Chris. Chris and I were having a discussion. And he says, I really appreciate the 3 impingements, 3 strategies, 3 solutions for the shoulder that you did. Would there be something similar going on in the hip regarding impingement? And if so, could you do the same thing for the hip that you did for the shoulder? Thanks. So Chris, you're not going to believe this, but this hip impingement thing is exactly like the impingements in the shoulder. We just have to look at it from the appropriate perspective. And so when we did the shoulder thing, we talked about the 3 classic impingement tests that we would use, and then we gave solutions. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to compare these hip representations directly to the shoulder representations, and you'll kind of see how this all plays out. And so we'll talk about like what interferes and what doesn't, and then we'll give some exercise progression. So there'll be a fair number of exercise examples in this, I think, as we go through this. So let's break this down a little bit. So we had in the shoulder, we did the Hawkins-Kennedy, we did a Nears test, and then we did like the classic painful arc. And so the way that these are going to be represented in the hip is going to be through our hip flexion, traditional hip flexion measures, and through our abduction measures. So all of these are going to be representative of external rotation measures, but the interference is going to be internal rotation in every case. And so we're going to have a situation where, because of the orientation, we're going to give up some ER. We're going to have an overemphasis on the IR, and that's what causes the compressive strategies that can actually result in pain, or as we would say, a diagnosis of impingement. And so let's look at the Hawkins-Kennedy test first. So if we look at the shoulder, we're going to see that it's internal rotation at about 90 degrees of traditional flexion, and so that would be representative of internal rotation superimposed on a little bit of hip flexion at 90 degrees in the hip. And so there's our commonality. But what we got as far as findings are concerned is this is going to be a situation where we've got posterior lower compression. So we're going to lose early hip flexion because hip external rotation under these circumstances would be in this early stage of hip flexion. But the problem is we got to think about this in 4D. Remember, it's not an arc. Okay, so if I'm coming up this way, that would normally be external rotation. The problem is under these circumstances with the posterior lower compression, external rotation is way out there. And so external rotation goes this way, not straight up in front. If I go straight up in front, I'm moving into internal rotation, which means I'm going to max out my internal rotation too soon. And then under those circumstances, I keep driving harder internal rotation, and I bang into it right at 90 degrees. And so there's my compressive strategy. So what we have here is an outlet, a pelvic outlet that wants to remain narrow, wants to remain eccentrically oriented. So as far as interference goes, we want to eliminate all of this bilateral hip extension kind of stuff, because again, ER is way out there. We want to restore it here in the middle. So this means that those of you who are just fond of your hip thrust because you wanted glute development, let's get off of that train right now. No low cable pull throughs, and then your reverse hypers are also going to be off the table under those circumstances. So from an exercise standpoint, we want to reorient the pelvis, and we're going to stick with unilateral activities. And so you know how I love my cross connects, and so we're going to use a cross connect, but I want you to pay attention to something very, very important here, and this is going to be your foot contacts. And so if we're doing a supine cross connect, we want to make sure that we're capturing the foot position on the wall. This is first met head on the ground, so to speak. The ground is now the wall, and we got that medial heel contact. We want to maintain that throughout, because this is where we're starting to initiate internal rotation from an externally rotated position. And this is what we have to recapture when we're talking about reorienting the pelvis. And then we want to move to something that's a little bit more hip flexion, so we can move into a hook lying situation. We still want to induce some internal rotation, so we're going to put something between your knees to hang on to that internal rotation, but from a position of external rotation first. Once we can capture 90 degrees of hip flexion, we got a lot of cool stuff that we can do. So we can start some rolling activities, and we're going to teach you how to roll into the affected side, and we're going to drive propulsive strategies on the opposing side. As far as some gym related stuff, we want to use, we can use our box squat, but we're going to use a touch and go. So remember, we've got an eccentrically oriented pelvic diaphragm. We want to concentrically orient that sucker. And so if I unload on the box, I'm going to get some of that eccentric orientation and some yielding action that I don't want. I can then, again, because I have 90 degrees of hip flexion, I can start to turn into that side, so I can start to capture a true internal rotation at the right point. And so that's going to be my Jefferson split squat's going to become real handy, because I'm going to start from that ER orientation, and I'm going to hang on to ER orientation as I start to superimpose the normal IR on top of it. We could use split stance activities that are using like an ipsilateral cable load. So if I was doing a left foot forward split squat, I could put the cable in the left hand, hold that left side back, and again, I'm going to move from an ER position to an IR position under those normal circumstances. 3D straps that are going to push you into the original orientation and teach you how to resist and move into it. Another great opportunity to recapture these positions. Let's move on to the next one. So we talked about the near, which is impingement above 120 degrees in the shoulder. So we're going to represent this kind of the same way. So this is going to be the end range hip flexion measure, where we're going to start to feel that impingement. And so what we have here is a situation where what I need under those circumstances to have a normal hip flexion and range is that I have to have a lumbar spine that can turn towards that measurement side of the hip, so the ipsilateral side. If a spine can't turn that way, then I'm going to end up with that end range impingement. So this is going to be a wide ISA that can't close. And so now I have a concentrically oriented pelvic diaphragm. So right away, my interference is going to be hinging activities. So I got to minimize hinging activities. The exception might be a higher box squat with a delay strategy on the box, so I can get the outlet to eccentrically orient and capture some yielding action. So that might be the exception to that. We do have 90 degrees available to us, so we can do all sorts of cool things. So we're going to start in a staggered chopping action. We want to reduce the effects of gravity, but we also want to start to be able to turn the spine towards the affected side. And so in the staggered stance, we're not compressing that hip, and we can start to encourage the turn of the sacrum, turn of the spine in that direction. This is where we're going to start to use our Camperini deadlift, because again, we do have 90 degrees available to us. We want to turn the spine. So I'm going to put a contralateral load on my Camperini deadlift towards the heels elevated side, and again, to turn the spine and the sacrum. If I want to go into a split squat activity, I can do that as well, but I'm going to elevate the front heel under these circumstances. So again, I want to maintain that yield as I move into that 90 degrees. If I need to promote more expansion, more yielding action, I can start to move you into a prone propulsive activity as well. Ultimately, what I want to be able to do is to recapture an eccentrically oriented pelvic outlet in deep hip flexion. So my ultimate resolution here is going to be a heels elevated deep squat with a band around the knees, but this is not pushing out into the band. This is maintaining an orientation of the femur so I can get the pelvis to move around the femur, and this is going to help me capture that eccentric orientation of the outlet in the bottom of the deep squat. And so basically, we're at the top of the squat, we're going to take an inhale, we're going to exhale to mid-range where we would typically have the concentric orientation, and then I'm going to re-inhale to eccentrically orient the pelvic diaphragm as I sit down into that deep squat. Okay, so that covers the Hawkins-Kennedy in the shoulder with the equivalent in the hip, the near in the shoulder with the equivalent in the hip, and so now we have to have a painful arc. And so under these circumstances, what we're going to use is the traditional hip abduction measure, also an external rotation measure. And so what we're going to see here is we're going to have a hip that has a lot of internal rotation and not a lot of external rotation, and we're going to see that limitation in hip abduction or external rotation, and we're going to get more of a lateral type of a discomfort. Where this is going to commonly show up is we're going to see people with the right oblique orientation of the pelvis. And so where we get the compressive strategy is here, and it's going to drive this left side up and over the right side. So this is our typical right oblique, and what we're going to see is we're going to see the impingement on this side. And so this is the inability to acquire a late propulsive strategy on that affected side. So from an interference standpoint, we want to avoid the bilateral symmetrical activities for a while, because what we have to do under these circumstances is take that right side and push back into the left to overcome the oblique axis. So we can start in left side lying with a right propulsive type of an activity. In this case, if we go into the gym, we're going to use our camper knee deadlift again with the heel elevated, but this time we're going to put an ipsilateral load on that heel elevated side, because what we want to do is we want to hold that back and push with the right foot, and that load's going to emphasize that right push. So again, we're turning back against the oblique. We can do a right foot forward, front foot elevated, right side loaded split squat. So this is about driving that late propulsive strategy on the right side all day, every day. Right suitcase carry is going to get us there. Go back to the video that we did about the suitcase carry. It was a week or so ago, and you'll see that we were talking about increasing max P on the opposing side, but we're going to take advantage of the ipsilateral side under these circumstances, where we would normally use like a cable chopping activity in the early phases of trying to recapture the turn of the spine. Under these circumstances, I'm going to use a cable lift because I'm trying to drive that right propulsive strategy, and it's much easier to do a cable lift under these circumstances and still capture the turn into the opposite side. A little bit of a finish kind of conditioning thing. Your right to left sled drag is going to be a nice way to finish, because again, we're just emphasizing that right propulsive strategy. So Chris, I hope that is helpful for you and for the rest of you. Remember, the shoulders and the hips are very much the same, so don't treat them any differently. Very, very useful in regards to your conformations and checks and balances in regards to range of motion, so use them accordingly. If you have any other questions, please go to askbillhartman@gmail.com, askbillhartman@gmail.com, and I will see you guys tomorrow.